My name is Marin, and I'm 41 years old. 3 Saturdays ago, I was standing in my mother's kitchen, scraping cold wax off the rim of a cake plate, when I heard her tell a room full of people that I was the family disappointment. She didn't whisper it. She said it the way you say a thing you've said so many times it's gone smooth in your mouth. Marin? Oh, Marin's our disappointment. Always has been. We learned not to expect much there. And then the little laugh she does, the one that lets her take it back without taking it back. And then my brother Drew's louder one, landing right on top of hers. I was holding her birthday cake when I heard it. 7 candles on it, 1 for every decade. I did not drop it. My face did not go hot. I just set the plate down on the counter, very gently, next to the sink, and I stood there for a second and listened to my own heartbeat. She was 70 years old that day. She was standing in the middle of a living room. She was completely certain belonged to her. It hadn't belonged to her for 8 years. Welcome back to Revenge Settles, where the quietest person in the room turns out to be the one holding the whole thing up. If you've ever been the dependable one that nobody thanks, the one they only call when something breaks, this story is for you. Stay with me, drop a comment, and subscribe. Now let me take you back to that kitchen, and then back 8 years before it, because you can't understand the cake without the deed. Let me tell you what I actually do, because it matters, and because it's the part my family always waved off like it was nothing. I read deeds for a living. I'm a title examiner. When you buy a house, before the money moves, somebody has to go back through 40, 60, 100 years of records and make sure the person selling it actually owns it. That there's no old lien hiding in the chain, no second cousin with a claim nobody mentioned, no tax the county is quietly waiting to collect. I'm the person who finds the crack before it becomes a hole somebody falls through. It is not glamorous work. My brother Drew used to call it Marin's little paperwork job. Drew sells commercial real estate, or he did, on and off. Between the years he was launching something and the years he was recovering from the something he launched. In my family, Drew was the one with the big future. I was the one with the little paperwork job. People trust me because I don't flinch at bad news in a file. A number is a number. A signature is a signature. It either holds up or it doesn't, and how I feel about it changes nothing. I think that's also why I was good at being the family disappointment for so long. You can carry a lot when you've trained yourself not to react to what's on the page. It started early, the role. I want you to understand, it wasn't one cruel thing. It was 1,000 small ones, sorted and filed over a lifetime. When I was 12, I won a county math competition and my mother forgot to come because Drew had a baseball game that got rained out and rescheduled, and somehow the rescheduled game still beat my trophy. When I got my associate's degree at night while working days, my father asked, kindly, when I was going to go for the real one. When I bought my little apartment with my own money and no help from anyone. My mother told the relatives I was renting somewhere downtown because a daughter who owned a small place was somehow more embarrassing to her than a daughter who rented a nicer-sounding one. None of it was loud. That's the thing about my family. The contempt never raised its voice either. It just sat there, smooth and certain, in every introduction, every comparison, every seat I got at the far end of the table. I learned the shape of it so young that by 41, it didn't even sting in the normal place anymore. It had worn a groove. So when she said the word disappointment over the birthday cake, she wasn't telling the room anything new. She was just reading aloud from a file the whole family had been keeping on me my entire life. The only difference was that this time, in the next room, the person being filed was holding the deed to the building they were all sitting in. My father died 8 years ago. His name was Walter, and he was a kind man who was very bad with money in a quiet, prideful way that nobody found out about until he was gone. I found out about it the way I find out about everything. In the records. About a month after the funeral, my mother asked me to look at some letters that had started coming. She handed me a shoebox. She said it the way you hand someone a jar you can't open. And in that shoebox was the second mortgage my father had taken on the house without telling her, and the 3 years of property taxes he had stopped paying when the money got tight, and a notice from the county that I had read 1,000 times in other people's files, and never once in my own. The house was going to a tax sale, 11 weeks out. The home she had lived in for 30 years, The home she was at that moment certain my father had left her comfortable in was about to be sold on the courthouse steps for the back taxes. And she did not know, and she could not have followed the math if I'd drawn it on the wall. So I want you to hold one number in your head, because I couldn't, for 8 years. I'll come back to it. The number is what that house cost me, and the strange thing, the thing I'm a little ashamed of, is that I never once sat down and added it up. I told myself I didn't want to know. The truth is I was afraid of it. Here is what I did, and I did it quietly, the way I do everything. I went to a man I knew from work, a real estate attorney named Frank, who owed me a few favors for catching things in his files over the years. And between us, over about 9 weeks, we did the only thing that would actually save the house. I paid off the back taxes. I bought out the second mortgage. And to do it cleanly, to make sure no future lien or no future bad decision could ever put my mother on the courthouse steps again, the title to the house came into my name. I want to be honest about that, because I've turned it over a lot since the birthday. I didn't take the house from her. I took the debt off it, and the deed came with the debt, and I left her living in it exactly as she always had. As far as the day-to-day went, nothing changed. She slept in the same bedroom. She kept her garden. She hosted the same holidays in the same dining room. What changed was that every property tax bill now came to me. Every time the roof leaked, I paid for the roof. When the boiler finally died, I paid for the boiler. And the title, the actual ownership, the thing my whole career is built on noticing, sat in my name, in the county records where anybody could have looked, and nobody ever did. I told my mother the house was taken care of. That's the phrase I used. I was careful never to lie. I never said, "You own it free and clear." I said, "It's taken care of, Mom. Don't worry about it." And she did the thing she has always done, which is hear the version of a sentence that cost her the least. Within a year, the story had already changed in her telling. She would say it at dinners. "Walter left us comfortable. Thank God the house was paid off when your father passed." And I would sit there with my fork and let her have it. Because correcting her would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant she'd have to feel something she didn't want to feel. And somehow that always became my job to prevent. Not one of them, in 8 years, ever asked whose name was on the title. Not my mother, not Drew. They didn't want to know, because knowing would have come with a thank you attached, and a thank you is a kind of admission. So they built a different story instead. In that story, I was the daughter who never married, never had kids, never made the kind of money Drew made in his big years, the one with the little paperwork job and the small apartment, the disappointment. And I let them tell it, because I thought, underneath the telling, they knew. I thought the gratitude was just buried somewhere I couldn't see it. That's the lie I lived on for 8 years. I know what you're thinking, because I've thought it about myself plenty of times since. How does a smart woman, a woman who reads ownership for a living, who finds the crack in everybody else's story, let her own go on for 8 years? How do you save a house in secret and then sit there, year after year, and eat your dinner while they call you the small one? I'll tell you the honest answer. It's because the secret was the only place I had any standing in that family. As long as I knew the thing they didn't, as long as I was quietly the reason the lights stayed on, I had a kind of power, even if it was a power I never used and they never saw. I told myself that was enough. I told myself that knowing was its own reward, that I didn't need the credit, that I was above needing it. And for a long time that story held, the way a roof holds, right up until the day it doesn't, and you finally look up and see how long the water's been getting in. The birthday was the day I looked up. The thing that started to crack it was the boiler. This was 2 winters ago. The boiler in my mother's house, which is to say my house, which is to say the house, finally gave out in January. A new one runs about $9,000 installed when you need it fast in the cold, and you always need it fast in the cold. Now, normally, I would have just paid it, quietly, the way I'd paid for everything. But something in me that winter was tired in a way I hadn't been before, and I decided, almost as an experiment, to do something I never did. I brought it up at a family dinner. I said, lightly, the way you float a thing you already know the answer to, "The boiler at Mom's needs replacing. It's about $9,000. I was thinking maybe we could split it, since it's the family house." I want to tell you exactly what happened, because it's the moment I started keeping score, even though I didn't admit that to myself yet. My mother put her hand flat on the table and said she was on a fixed income and she couldn't be expected to come up with that kind of money at her age. Which was true, and which I had never once asked her to do, in 8 years. Drew leaned back and said things were tight for him right now. The market was soft, but that, obviously, we'd figure it out as a family. And then his wife, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse, said, "Well, Marin, you don't have kids. You don't have a mortgage. You can absorb it easier than the rest of us. You can absorb it, like I was a sponge, like that was a quality I had, instead of a thing being done to me." I remember exactly what was on the table. A bowl of green beans nobody was eating. The good salt, the one in the little dish, that my mother only puts out when Drew comes. I remember looking at that salt and thinking that I had bought the dining room it was sitting in, and the dining room didn't know, and the salt didn't know, and the 3 people passing it back and forth didn't know. And somehow I was the one who was supposed to feel embarrassed for asking. I paid for the boiler. Of course I paid for the boiler. I called the company on Monday and gave them my card, and never said another word about it at a dinner again. But I drove home that night, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of my building for a long time, with the engine off, watching my own breath fog the windshield, because I wasn't even running the heat. And I noticed that I wasn't sad. I was something flatter than sad. I was clear. It was the first genuinely clear thing I'd felt in years, and it scared me a little, how clean it was. After the boiler, I ran a second experiment, and this one I planned. The property tax bill comes in the fall. For 8 years I had paid it the week it arrived, the way you'd put out a small fire before anyone smells smoke. That fall, I didn't. I let it sit. Not because I wasn't going to pay it. I always pay it. I let it sit because I wanted to know one thing. I wanted to know if a single person in my family was aware that the bill existed. 6 weeks went by. The second notice came. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody could have, because nobody knew there was such a thing as a tax on the house they all assumed was paid off forever. My mother spent those 6 weeks planning a trip to her sister's and complaining that I hadn't called enough. I paid it on the last possible day, and I learned the size of the silence I'd been living inside. It wasn't that they were ungrateful for what I did. It's that, to them, the thing I did didn't exist. You can't be ungrateful for a thing you don't know is happening. I wasn't a person who'd saved the house. I was just the weather. The house was simply dry, the way it was simply warm, and nobody thanks the roof. The third thing wasn't an experiment. The third thing came to me. That spring, my mother left me a voicemail, the rambling kind she leaves when she's been talked into something and wants me to agree before I've had time to think. Drew had an opportunity. Drew always had an opportunity. This one needed capital, and Drew had explained to her, very patiently I'm sure, that the smart thing, the thing anybody with a head for money would do, was to borrow against the house. Her house. Pull out some of that equity that was just sitting there doing nothing. And she was calling to tell me about it, not to ask me, because in her mind there was nothing to ask. The house was hers. You can borrow against your own house. I sat with that voicemail for a long time, because here was the part none of them could see. You cannot borrow against a house you don't own. The second Drew walked my mother into a bank to pull equity out of that house. A title examiner exactly like me would pull the record, exactly like I do 40 times a week, and find my name where my mother swore hers would be, and the whole quiet thing I'd built to protect her would come apart in the worst possible room in front of a loan officer with Drew's hand already out. I didn't call her back that day. I let it sit, the way I'd let the tax bill sit, and I felt the clear thing get clearer. They weren't just failing to thank me. They were now, without knowing it, about to walk straight into the wall I'd spent 8 years standing in front of, and some cold, level part of me thought, maybe it's time they met the wall. And then one night, finally, I ran the total. I'm a title examiner. Pulling a complete financial history is the most ordinary thing in the world to me. I just never pointed the skill at my own life. I sat down at my table with the closing statement from when I bought out the mortgage, the lien payoff, 8 years of tax receipts, the roof, the boiler, the water heater before the boiler, the tree that came down on the garage, all of it. and I added it up the way I add up a stranger's house. $152,000. That's what the family disappointment had quietly put into the family house in 8 years. $152,000 on a little paperwork job, with no kids and no mortgage, while they passed the story of my smallness around the table like a dish nobody wanted seconds of. I cried for about 4 minutes. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I sat there, and the number blurred, and I cried. And then I wiped my face with the back of my hand and I stopped, because crying is a feeling, and a feeling isn't a plan. And I had spent 8 years feeling things instead of deciding them. What I cried about, if I'm honest, wasn't the money. I make enough. I'd structured my life small and quiet, and the $152,000 had gone out in pieces so slow I never felt the cut. What I cried about was the math underneath the math. $152,000 buys a lot of things, and one of the things it had quietly bought, year after year, was the right for my family to keep calling me the disappointment. I had been paying, in full, on time, for the privilege of being looked down on at my own mother's table. That was the number that actually landed, not the dollars, the exchange rate. I could have printed that ledger. I could have brought it to the next dinner and read it out loud, line by line, and watched their faces change. Believe me, I pictured it. But loud was their language, not mine. I have never once won an argument in my family by getting louder. I lose every time I try to fight in the language they're fluent in. So I decided to do it in mine. If you've ever sat alone with a number you were afraid to add up, you already know exactly how I felt at that table. Stay with me. What I did next wasn't loud, and it wasn't cruel, and I never raised my voice once. It was just true, and true was the one thing they had never had to deal with. If this is landing close to home, leave a comment and hit subscribe so you don't miss how it ends. Here's the thing I want you to understand about what I decided, because if you get this wrong, you'll think this is a story about a woman taking a house back. It isn't. I went back to Frank, the attorney. I told him I wanted to do 2 things, and I wanted them done so cleanly that no one could ever argue with the paper. First, I wanted to transfer the house to my mother. Fully, into her name alone, free and clear, no lien, no strings. I wanted to give her the house. Frank looked at me over his glasses for a second and said, "Marin, you understand that to give it to her, you have to first let her find out it was never hers." And I said yes. That was the whole point. That was the only part that mattered. Because the second thing I wanted was to stop. Stop paying the taxes. Stop fixing the boilers. Stop being the weather. The day I handed her the deed would be the last day I covered a single dollar of that house. From then on, it would be hers in every way it had never been hers. The roof, the bills, the cold January when the boiler dies. All of it. Mine to give, and then gone. People hear that and they wait for the catch. There's no catch. I didn't want money back. I'd already decided I would never see a cent of that $152,000, and I made my peace with that before I ever walked into Frank's office. This was never about collecting. It was about closing the account. Frank asked me why I didn't just sell it. He wasn't being cruel, he was being a lawyer. He said, "Marin, it's in your name. You could list it tomorrow. You'd be made whole and then some, and frankly, you'd be within your rights." And he was right. I would have been. But that wasn't the move. Selling it out from under her would have made me the villain in the story they already told, the cold daughter who took the family home. It would have handed them their version of me, gift-wrapped, forever. No, I wanted to do the one thing the story had no room for. I wanted to give her more than she thought she had, and let the giving be the thing that told the truth. So we built it carefully, the way I build everything. The deed transfer, drawn up clean, her name alone, signed and notarized, and ready to record the moment I chose. I had Frank double-check the legal description against the survey twice, because a title examiner who botches her own deed deserves what she gets. We made sure there was nothing left attached to it, no lien, no judgment, no surprise, so that when it became hers it was as clean as a house can be, the cleanest gift I could make. And then there was the part I didn't tell Frank about, the page I wrote myself, which I'll come back to in a second, because I want you to see the room first. That page was an accounting, not a bill, an accounting, and the difference is everything. I wrote it in my own plain handwriting because I wanted it in my hand and not a lawyer's. 8 years, line by line. The lien payoff, the arrears, the taxes, year by year, the roof, the boiler, the water heater, the tree that took the garage. All of it ending in that number, $152,000, and at the bottom one sentence, the only sentence on the page that wasn't a figure. Paid in full, by me. Asking nothing. I put both pages in a manila envelope, the deed and the accounting. I didn't seal it dramatically. I just tucked the flap. And then I waited, because the channel I belong to, the kind of person I am, doesn't make a scene. I let them set the stage. I only change what gets said on it. I knew the room would come. With Drew reaching for the equity, the room was always going to come. I just had to be holding the envelope when it did. The room arrived about 3 weeks later, a Sunday dinner at the house. It arrived faster than I expected, and it arrived because of Drew, which I should have predicted, because Drew can't sit near a thing of value without reaching for it. Halfway through dinner, between the roast and the part where my mother starts asking when everyone's leaving, Drew set down his fork and announced that he and Mom had been talking about the house. He said it to the table, but he was watching me, the way you watch the one person who might say something inconvenient. He said that with Mom getting older, it made sense to get her name and mine both on the deed, to keep it simple, so that when the time came, there'd be no mess. He said the word equity. He said the house was the family's biggest asset, and it was just smart to plan. And there it was, the voicemail, grown up and wearing a tie. The equity idea from the spring hadn't gone away, it had just gotten organized. Drew had moved it from a phone call to a dinner, from a maybe to an announcement, and now he was going to do it in front of everyone, so that saying no would look like me being difficult. Me being the disappointment who couldn't just let the family plan. He'd even brought a folder. Actual folder, set beside his plate, that he kept touching like it made him taller. My mother nodded along while he talked, like he was reading her a poem. She said, "Drew's so good with this kind of thing. Not everyone has a head for it." And she looked, very briefly, at me. The one with the little paperwork job. And she gave the room that smooth, practiced smile, the same one from the birthday, and I knew she was about to say it again. The disappointment line, I could feel it loading in her, the way you feel a sneeze coming in someone else. And the whole table was warm and full and certain, passing the good salt around, dividing up a house that not one single person sitting at it owned. I reached down to the bag by my chair and I took out the envelope, and I set it on the table, in the middle, next to the roast, and I slid it toward my mother, papers placed, not thrown. I made sure of that. I had practiced even that. I said, "Before anyone adds a name to anything, Mom, you should open that." She opened it the way she'd handed me the shoebox 8 years before, like a jar she couldn't open. She got the deed out and she read the top of it, and I watched her not understand it, and then I watched the exact second she did. Because her name wasn't on it as the owner, mine was. It had been mine for 8 years, and the page in her hands was the one that changed that, the page that gave it to her. She said, "I don't. What is this?" Not a question. The words just came out flat and lost. And it was my Aunt Carol, my mother's own sister, sitting to her left, who read it over her shoulder and said it for the whole room, in a voice that had gone very quiet. "Eleanor, this says, Marin owns the house. This says she's owned it the whole time." And then, after a second, slower, like she was doing the math none of them had ever done, "Eleanor, she's been paying for it, all of it, for 8 years. Then it got loud. But here's the thing I want you to notice, the thing that is the entire point of this. They got loud. I did not. Drew stood up so fast his chair went over. He said I'd gone behind everyone's back, that this was manipulative, that I'd trapped Mom, that a real daughter wouldn't have hidden something like this. He actually said the word hidden about a public record to a title examiner. My mother's face was doing several things at once, and the one that won, the one that always wins with her, was the one that turned it into something done to her. "You let me think," she started. "You let me stand there and she couldn't finish it, and I didn't finish it for her. I waited until the noise ran out of road, the way it always does, and then I said the only thing I'd come to say, and I said it at the same volume you'd use to ask someone to pass the salt. I'm not asking for thanks. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm not asking for the money, and I don't want a single dollar of it back. The deed in your hand puts the house in your name, Mom. Yours alone, free and clear. It's the most I've ever given you, and it's the last thing I'm going to give you, because starting today, I stopped paying for it. The taxes are yours now. The roof is yours. The next boiler is yours. I'm just done paying to be your disappointment." And then I picked up my own plate, because I'd been raised not to leave a mess, and I carried it to the kitchen and rinsed it and set it in the rack. I could hear them behind me. I didn't turn around. I got my coat. Drew said my name twice, the second time with a question mark on it, like he'd just thought of something he needed from me, which he had, because there was always something. I said goodnight to my Aunt Carol, who squeezed my hand, and I left. I didn't slam the door. There was nothing to slam. I just finally stopped holding one open. I'll tell you what happened after, because you'll want to know, and then I'll tell you the one thing I actually carry out of it. The house went into my mother's name the following week, exactly as I'd drawn it up. I recorded it myself. It was, I think, the cleanest transfer I've ever handled, and I've handled thousands. The first tax bill in her own name arrived that fall. I know this because she called me about it, not angry by then, just frightened, asking what it was and what she was supposed to do with it, and for a moment the old machine in me started up, the part that fixes things before anyone smells smoke. And then I told her, kindly, that Drew was so good with this kind of thing, and that she should ask him. I wasn't being cruel. I just wasn't being the weather anymore. Drew did not, in the end, have a head for it. The name he'd wanted on the deed so badly turned out to come attached to a roof and a boiler in a county that wants its money every single year, whether the market is soft or not. He'd been so eager to be on the title when the title meant asset. He went very quiet about it once the title meant responsible. The folder he'd brought to dinner never came up again. I heard about most of it secondhand, because I'd stopped being the family switchboard. The gutters went that first spring and nobody caught it until there was a stain spreading across the dining room ceiling, right over the spot where the good salt used to sit. The water heater I'd replaced years ago, the one before the boiler, finally gave out, and this time there was no weather to fix it overnight. So my mother went 4 days with cold showers in her own home and called Drew, who was, he said, slammed at work. Within about 2 years, she sold the house she'd been certain my father left her comfortable in, the house I had carried on a little paperwork job for 8 years, and she moved into a smaller place. And as far as I know, she tells a version of that too, one where it was her idea, her good sense, her plan to downsize. I hope she believes it. It costs me nothing now to let her, and I've found that's the cleanest kind of generosity there is, the kind that doesn't cost you anything, because you finally stopped overpaying. The strangest part is what didn't happen. There was no big reckoning, no tearful phone call where my mother understood. People want that part, I know. They want the scene where the family realizes. It didn't come, and I stopped needing it to. The deed told the truth more completely than any apology could have, because an apology is just words, and the deed was 8 years of my life in a form that couldn't be argued with. I'd handed them the truth notarized. What they did with it after that was theirs. The one thing I carry out of it is my niece, Drew's daughter, Sophie. She was 19 at that dinner, sitting at the corner of the table saying nothing, the way I used to. About a month after, she texted me. She didn't say anything about the house, or her dad, or my mother. She said, "Can you teach me how to read a deed? I want to know how you saw all that. And we've been getting coffee once a month ever since." And I show her how to follow a chain of title back through the years, how to find the crack before it becomes a hole somebody falls through. She's good at it. She's not afraid of bad news in a file. I see myself in her, the useful part, the part that was never actually a disappointment, just unthanked. Here's the thing I'd want you to take, if you take anything. Generosity isn't a debt the people you love get to collect from you forever. Being the one who quietly holds everything up does not mean you've agreed to hold it up until it breaks your back. You're allowed to set the plate down gently and walk to the kitchen. You don't have to throw it. You just have to stop carrying it. I gave my mother the house. I want you to sit with how strange that is. The most generous thing I ever did for her and the last thing I ever did for her were the same act, in the same envelope, in the same quiet voice. That's not contradiction. That's what release looks like when you do it without raising your voice. If you've ever been the one quietly keeping everyone afloat, the dependable one nobody thanks, the weather, let this be your sign. You don't have to make a scene to stop. You're allowed to give them the whole thing, and then put it down, and go home to a place that's actually yours. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who's been carrying a family on a job everyone calls little. Drop a comment and tell me your version. I read them. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.